She has an enormous body of work to show, and I think people will look back in the future.
In the 90s, she was light in motion, alive, effortless, untouchable. Every runway felt choreographed around her. Every designer wanted her grace to finish their sentence. She could shift from elegance to chaos in a single step, and the crowd adored her for it. For a while, it seemed like she was everywhere, the face of beauty that refused to stand still. And then, one year, she was gone. No one knew why the woman who embodied movement had disappeared. So what happened to Shalom Harlow? She never learned to stand still. Movement was the first language her body understood, a childhood of dance lessons stitched into muscle memory until rhythm felt like comprehension.
I danced back home for about 7 years. Ballet, tap, jazz, whole bit.
Even then, something in the way she moved set her apart. Teachers said she didn't dance to music, she translated it. When fashion finally called, she didn't pose to be looked at. She moved to make the fabric speak back. Toronto, late 80s. Discovered at a Cure concert, signed before she had time to decide what she wanted to be.
When I started coming to do shows in New York had a pretty electric energy then. It was the early 90s, and there was a lot of really fun theatrical types that were designing, and so the runway.
Within a year, the quiet girl was in New York, learning the strange etiquette of light, where a room full of strangers names what your bones already know, and a photographer's countdown becomes another kind of music.
Flaunt their stuff. I had no relationship to the fashion world whatsoever. I'd never even seen a fashion magazine. I grew up without a television and just really wasn't very connected to pop culture in that way. It was like Alice in Wonderland.
She doesn't waited for instruction, she followed the tempo.
I had no reference point for anything, and I was suddenly in Paris on catwalks for designers that I could barely even pronounce their name.
By the mid-90s, she is everywhere, and yet never loud. Versace for velocity and heat, Dior and Chanel for line and discipline, Valentino for the long exhale of elegance, McQueen for the future tense.
When I was 17, I moved to Paris to give modeling a try. And in the first 2 weeks, I met Johnny and Donatella, and they gave me the gracious opportunity to walk for the first time in Paris on the Versace Couture catwalk.
In each house, she became the sentence that finished the designer's thought, not a mannequin, an interpreter, walking as if punctuation were stitched into the hem. By then, fashion itself had started to change its language, and Shalom was part of that shift. Shalom defined a generation that treated the runway like theater, but beside her was something that made the picture wider, the story larger, more than a peer, more than a sidekick. Amber Valletta, not competition, but counterpoint. If Shalom was water, Amber was glass, different textures of the same reflection. The industry loved the symmetry. They were booked together constantly, campaigns, editorials, magazine covers.
More of a helpful thing with the girls. And you can often see Shalom with her best friend on and off the catwalk, Amber Valletta. Why do all the designers always put them together in the shows?
Just naturally, sort of instinctively know that they're going to get the best from both of us. If, you know, they're together. We feed off of each other, and there's something special that happens when we're together. And
in the 90s, when tabloids gave every friendship a brunnant, they became the Twisted Sisters. Shalamber, a shorthand for chemistry that cameras couldn't fake.
There's some video footage of me overtaking Amber on the runway.
House of Style turned them into MTV's favorite in-joke. Backstage roommates, sisters in glamour, two halves of a myth that moved in sync. They didn't chase it. The world just liked seeing them share a frame.
I was just feeling the music and walking, and I overtook her. She was extra slouchy that day. She was moving slower than usual. You can see as we're walking back, I turn to her and I say a few things. The first thing I say is, "Keep up with me." and then you see me turn and say something else to her and say, "Okay, now turn."
Photographers called it presence. Designers called it control. The audience just couldn't look away. Photographers adored that rhythm. Stephen Meisel shot them like opposites in orbit, one fierce, one serene, each defining the other's light. Patrick de Marchelier saw in her something quieter, a symmetry that could carry silence without losing presence. To him, she wasn't posing, she was phrasing.
I don't think of the camera as a camera. I just give whatever the photographer's looking for. And sometimes it works, sometimes.
And somewhere between their lenses, Shalom stopped being a model and became a mood. The moment when she started to look like thought. Even in her 20s, she was already becoming a reference point. Models studied her turns, directors borrowed her phrasing. A living archive, still in motion.
My first American Vogue cover. To have a brunette on the cover of Vogue was actually kind of semi-revolutionary.
Covers come the way seasons do. Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Elle, ID. Not because she floods the frame, but because she leaves air in it. A negative space that reads as intelligence. 1995 names her VH1/Vogue Model of the Year. And that line hardens into a premise the decade keeps repeating. Intelligence can wear a dress as easily as it wears a thesis. When House of Style returns in 1996, she becomes its translator. A pop bridge between atelier and living room, curious without being cute, fluent without condescension. She's teaching fashion to speak human. For a moment, her legacy was broadcast, a new way of listening to glamour. Who else could make couture sound like conversation? Through the 2000s, she keeps moving while others pause. Prada's clean intellect, Chloe's soft logic, Donna Karan's close-to-skin arguments, Galliano's narratives. And the longer she works, the clearer her function becomes. To prove that endurance can be elegant, that presence can be precise, that a face can outlast a fad if it learns to breathe at its own speed. They all called her to walk for them.
The key to a great model is somebody who gets rebooked by great people.
Forbes will later fold this into a number. The work itself doesn't need one. London, 1999. A warehouse that hums like a generator. Instructions that are not instructions at all. Trust me. The platform begins to turn while two robotic arms wake beside her like mechanical animals.
I landed in London straight off the red eye, was shown some rotating platform and told I was gonna stand on it while I got sprayed in spray paint, and that was the download. That's all the information I got. There was no rehearsal. I didn't hear the music. I did not know the amount of time, sequence that would be involved.
The first burst of paint finds the white dress before she does. Yellow, then black, and instinct lifts where choreography would have frozen. She answers the machine in its own grammar. Repetition, rhythm, precision. Impact becomes phrase, velocity becomes sentence. A duet between control and surrender, where the audience can't tell if they are witnessing performance or accident, and the ambiguity is the point.
Each day is Valentine's Day.
That show, Steve McQueen, number 13, would become Legend Evolution live.
This was purely spontaneously improvised, every moment of it. So what you saw was my first instinct responding to the moment.
20 years later, students still watch it in design schools, tracing the choreography of fear and beauty she made visible.
The piece of music, I think, informed the moment incredibly. The lighting design and just the way that the space held this moment.
Work did not slow, probably because work was the rhythm that keeps the fear out. Flights stack, seasons collapse. Time becomes a liturgy of fittings and pins, and the soft language of hands that build a dress around a body that always behaves. Professionals don't narrate fatigue. They make it look like grace. The body became both map and weapon, trained to anticipate the light, to hold its breath for beauty's sake. How long can discipline stay elegant before it starts to break? Then the silence, unannounced. Deep chronic illness will incite a nervous breakdown. I did have complex PTSD from the level of infections in my body. Years later, she names it without drama. Late-stage Lyme, severe black mold exposure from her house that looked like refuge and became a trap. A nervous system that refused the tempo it had obeyed for decades, and the kind of exhaustion that turns daylight into a physical fact. The woman who once conversed with machines learns to count breaths again, learns that standing is choreography when muscles forget their lines, And somewhere inside the long calendar of medicine and patience, something rearranges itself into wisdom you can't photograph. In Milan, 2018, the room bright and restless, the rumor already ahead of the lights. When she steps out, the decade between dissolves, not because nostalgia is powerful, but because presence is. The same command of space, the same measured velocity, only anchored differently now, centered inward. She wasn't the only one returning. The decade's icon stood beside her, proof that time had only refined what once burned bright. But when the lights hit her, it was clear. Shalom's art had never been nostalgia. It was continuity. Movement turned into memory. The applause broke like a held breath you didn't know you were holding until it leaves you. Backstage, there is a practical embrace and not much said. There rarely is when everyone understands the obvious. A few days later, the campaign camera caught her in a single uncoached take, spinning into fabric as if air had weighed again. Laughter not performed, but arriving. The short clip travels fast, because joy does when it's real. Since then, she chooses her moments, a runway, a cover, a collaboration, not as a myth returned, but as continuity resumed.